Good day, students. Welcome to yet another history class. Our topic of discussion for today is Benin in the 19th century. Now, before we go into the discussion proper, I want to quickly refer you to our study on Benin before the 19th century. And in that discussion, we were able to make it clear that Benin attained its greatness and prosperity in the 17th century. Now, the years after, that's before the 18th century, Benin was heard of not only in Africa, but even outside Africa. Benin was heard because of her prosperity, civilization, works of arts. That was what made Benin popular. So she attracted visitors from outside the continent to her own particular kingdom. Now, by the 18th century, Benin started showing some signs, some symptoms of decline, of weakness. And the weakness continued steadily until Benin collapsed in the 19th century. In the course of the lesson, I will outline some major reasons why Benin had to collapse. And Benin equally lost her vassal states in the 18th century. What are vassal states? They are dependent territories, territories that Benin had captured and brought them under her control. So in that same 18th century, those vassal states declared themselves independent. Now that tells you that Benin was weak. She could no longer hold those territories together again. Now at the beginning of the 19th century, Benin economy was still based on subsistence agriculture, trade, and creative art. So her economy was centered around these three: agriculture, trade, and creative art. Who did she trade with? She traded with Nupe, Ijebu, Ishekiri, as well as the Europeans. Now, basically, the Europeans, they came for slaves, and they majorly trade around Port Ugoton. That's the major port in Benin. So the Europeans would arrive at that particular port and then look for the slaves they came for. And then once they were able to get the slaves, they would transport them straight back to Europe. Now, because of the introduction of slave trade, the Benin trade suffered. Why? Because it was in that same 19th century that the trade was abolished. Now, what do we mean by abolition? The trade stopped. The Europeans themselves decided that slave trade was evil and that there was no how they would continue with that particular trade. Hence, the need to stop that particular trade. Now, it will interest you to know that the economy of Benin was relying so much on the trade. Her major revenue was derived from the trade. So with the abolition, completely Benin lost her revenue. And again, her trade with Ijebu equally stopped. Why? Because in the whole of Yoruba land, there was what we call the Yoruba civil wars. The entirety of Yoruba kingdoms were engulfed in war among themselves, not with outsiders. Ijebu, we have Ekiti, there was what we call the Parapo War. All of those wars affected the whole of Yoruba land, and it disrupted Benin's trade with those Yoruba kingdoms. Now, it is not possible for you to continue to trade during moments of war. Once there is war, there is no free movement. You cannot even go outside your domain because your safety is what matters most. So she lost her revenue. At the same time, the wars also disrupted her trade. Now, another event that happened in the 19th century that had effect on Benin was the issue of jihad. How did the jihad affect Benin? It also disrupted her trade with Nupe, And because of that, she lost Ishan and Ikiti, because the jihadists took over these two places, Ishan and Ikiti. They cut it out of Benin because these two places were still under the control or influence of Benin. So since the jihadists have taken over these two places, the revenue that Benin used to get from these two places was no longer coming. So it also affected her economically. Still, in the 19th century, with the abolition of slave trade, a new trade was introduced to replace the abolished trade. And what was that trade all about? It was all about palm oil trade, or what we call legitimate trade. Now, legitimate trade is a trade that deals in commodities, not human beings, as obtainable under the Atlantic slave trade. So in this particular trade, the commodity that was in high demand was what we call palm oil. Now, the palm oil trade was centered around the creeks, and Benin was located in the interior, in the hinterland, not close to the coastal area. So it placed her at a disadvantaged position. Now, the kingdoms that enjoyed that particular trade were kingdoms like Ishikiri, because Ishikiri was located at the coast. So she had much contact with Europeans who came for palm oil within the Niger Delta side. So the introduction of the palm oil trade actually affected Benin economically. Now, to conclude on the introductory part, I want to let you know that in the 19th century, Benin witnessed a period of political and economic decline. Those were the situations that Benin faced. Is political crisis in Benin. Political crisis in Benin. Now, in the second half of the 19th century, Benin witnessed increased political unrest, political disturbances. And those political disturbances were caused by what we call succession disputes. Now, those succession disputes basically were among princes, those who claim or who feel that once their father was no more, they automatically becomes the king. And you know, most kings in those days, it was not only one wife. They had so many wives. So the first sons, all of them will want to claim legitimacy to the throne. And that was what caused the succession dispute in the 19th century. Another cause of the unrest was the emergence of weak and unpopular rulers. Well, as a weak leader, if you fail to rule your people well, it will result into what we call civil wars. If you are unpopular, you make laws that are inimical to the people, it will equally result in what we call civil wars. So those were some of the causes of the political unrest in the second half of the 19th century in Benin. Now, because of succession disputes, weak and unpopular rulers, civil wars engulfed the whole of the kingdom. And because of the civil wars, the vassal states that I earlier on mentioned decided to revolt. They staged a kind of protest against the Benin kingdom, and then also decided to declare themselves independent. Since Benin was at war, they could not control or check what was happening in those vassal states. So those vassal states took advantage of what was happening in Benin and declared themselves independent. Well, even though Benin had a rule, or they had a law, that once the king died, automatically the crown prince, whom we call a Deacon, will succeed him. Even at that, with that particular law in place, there were still succession disputes. So it means that the laws were still not obeyed by the princes. Now, the political unrest, most especially the succession disputes that happened in the 19th century in Benin, started in the 1840s. In fact, the crisis became so pronounced in the 1840s, but it had a root in what happened in 1816. Now, let me quickly take you through the succession dispute, the history of the succession dispute that happened in Benin, most especially in the early part of the 19th century. Now in 1816, the king at that particular time, or the Oba at that particular time, was Oba Obanosa. Now, Obanosa ruled Benin for some time, and when he died, his two sons decided to struggle among themselves over the throne. Now he had two wives, and then both of them gave birth to two male children. So the two were struggling among themselves in order to succeed their father. Now, one of them was called Erigiawa, and the second one was called Obebo. Now, in the struggle between these two, it eventually resulted into a civil war. So a civil war engulfed the whole of the kingdom, because the two princes, they had their supporters. So the supporters of the two were the ones clashing among themselves. Now, at the end of the civil war, Obebo emerged as the winner and was crowned as the king. Now, unfortunately for him, he ruled Benin for just about 8 months, and he died. Now, when he died, automatically it was Erigiawa that remains. So, legitimately, he was appointed or crowned as the king. So, Erigiawa became the king and decided to take the title of a throne called Osemwede. That was the title he chose to be known with, or to be called with, Osemwede. Now, when he emerged as the king, I told you earlier that the jihadists had earlier on taken some parts of Benin, like Ishan and Ikiti. Now, when Osemwede emerged, he decided to force Ekiti, Akure, Ishan, all of them, to resume their payment of tribute to Benin. So he wanted to reassert the authority of Benin over those territories that were formerly under Benin. But then, shortly after giving such orders, Osemwede also died. And when he passed away, then his two sons also struggled over the throne. And who were those his two sons? Now, one of them was called Odinovba. Then the second one was called Obewekon. These were his two sons. Now, these two, as I said, struggled among themselves. And in the struggle, it favored Obewekon. So Obewekon emerged as the successor of his father, and he chose the title Adolo. So he was known as Oba Adolo. And he was crowned in 1848, and he ruled Benin until 1888. So you can see he ruled Benin for quite a long period of time. And in 1888, he died. And when he passed away, he was succeeded by his son too. And the name of his son was Idu Boa, but he chose to be called Ovonrawen. So his throne name was Oba Ovonrawen. Now, it was during the reign of Oba Ovonrawen that the British visited Benin. This time around, it was not just for trade, but they came in order to colonize the kingdom. Now, because of that, the British people forced or compelled the king to sign a treaty of protection with them. And if you are that foolish as a king to sign a treaty of protection with any British agent, what it means is that you have decided to give away your kingdom or the independency of your kingdom to the British. But he was compelled, he was forced to sign that particular treaty with the British. And that will form our next discussion, which will be the British and the fall of Benin. Before the second half of the 19th century, Benin was held in high esteem. She was highly respected, not only in Africa, but even outside Africa, especially in Europe, because of a high level of civilization, especially in arts. Now, Benin in the 18th century was already popular because of bronze work. most especially the Festa head. And because of that, most of these European countries were rushing to Africa in order to establish contact with that advanced kingdom located in Africa. Now, in the second half of the 19th century, these same Europeans, these same British people that were rushing to establish trade relationship, contact with Benin, started calling her all sorts of names. They were beginning to describe her with all kinds of names. For example, in that second half of the 19th century, they called her uncivilized, barbaric, indulging in human sacrifice, and a city of blood. That was how these same Europeans described Benin in the second half of the 19th century. This same group of people that were rushing to Benin have now turned their back against that particular kingdom. Now, in that second half of the 19th century, it was a period that most of these European countries were rushing to Africa in order to colonize some of these kingdoms. And the African kings were making effort in order to protect the independence of their own kingdoms. Now, it will interest you to know that Britain and Benin had close contact in the year 1862. And what happened in 1862 was that a consul called Richard Burton from England visited Benin. Now, who is a consul? A consul is a trade representative or a trade ambassador representing his country and other kingdom in order to establish a trade relationship. So he visited Benin with the aim of establishing a trade relationship on behalf of his country with Benin as a kingdom. Now, when he arrived and after his brief stay in Benin, Richard did not see anything good in Benin. Rather, he concluded that Benin was a kingdom suffering from moral decadence. And he said the only thing that will help bring Benin out of that decay was European civilization. So he concluded that when European civilization was introduced in Benin, then it would save her or it will prevent her from plunging more into what we call moral decadence. Now, in that same second half of the 19th century, the neighbors of Benin, kingdoms like Ishikiri, they had already signed treaties of protection with Britain. They had established that trade contact, or they had accepted the protection of Britain over their own kingdom. Now for the British, since other neighboring kingdoms had signed that particular treaty of protection with them, there was no how Benin will continue to refuse that particular offer. In fact, they explore all possible measures in order to compel Benin to sign that particular treaty. Now, Benin was left with no option, as I earlier mentioned, than to sign that particular treaty. And the following reasons accounted for why Benin had to sign that particular treaty. Now, number one, Britain was desperate in order to increase her trade in that particular area. And there was no how Benin would stand on her way. So she was so desperate, she was ready to use even force in order to establish that particular contact. Now, point number two was that Benin was monopolizing some trade in her own markets, especially the Oba. He was not allowing traders from Ishikiri and even the European traders that were residing in Ishikiri to trade in some articles. They regarded those articles as royal articles. So only the Oba will trade in such commodities. So he had monopoly over those ones. It was an action that angered traders in Ishikiri as well as the British traders who were residing in Ishikiri. Now, point number three was that there were evil practices going on in Benin. What were those evil practices? They were sacrificing human beings to their gods. And that was why earlier Richard Burton described the kingdom as a city of blood, because they were always killing slaves, sacrificing slaves to their gods in order to appease the gods and then to even favor the kingdom or to protect the kingdom against some natural disasters or calamities like that. So to the British, those actions must be stopped, especially that of human sacrifice. They must make effort in order to stop that. Then the last but not the least was Ovaronwen's refusal to see Consul Annesley in the year 1890 when he visited the kingdom. To the British, the refusal of the Oba to welcome their own representative in his own kingdom was a slap to their face, and they were not ready to accept such disgrace from an African kingdom. So they had to compel Benin to sign the treaty. Then eventually they would take over the control of the kingdom. Now, there was another consul that visited Benin in the year 1892, and we call him Galloway. Now, his main reason of visiting Benin was to compel the Oba to sign Treaty of Protection with Britain. And they will also compel the king to open up the markets, to declare the markets free for all traders. Now, that was the essence of his own visit. Now, after the visit ended with the signing of the treaty, as I said, in the year 1892. But the Oba himself refused to sign the treaty. And to the Oba, there were some religious rituals surrounding him which will not allow him to touch the pen. So he ordered some of his chiefs to sign the treaty on his behalf. Well, he was so crafty, he thought by avoiding holding the pen to sign that particular treaty, he thought the Europeans would not take the treaty serious. But for asking his chiefs to sign that particular treaty, to the British, it was a welcome development because he was the one that asked the chiefs to sign on his behalf. So they accepted the treaty as a treaty signed by the king. Now, in that treaty, some clauses were inserted to allow free trade. They declared Benin as a free trade zone to all European traders and to traders from Ishikiri and all the neighbors of Benin. So it was included in that particular treaty. But unfortunately, after signing the treaty, the Oba refused to allow free trade in his own kingdom. All the markets were still under his control. And those articles that he was asked to allow other traders to participate in them, he still monopolized those articles as royal articles. So no free trade area in his own market. Now, that particular action angered the British traders the more, and they reported the incident to the consul who was again residing in Ishikiri, so that he will come and compel the Oba to open the market for them. Now, in 1896, the acting consul called J.R. Phillips decided to visit Benin. And the essence of that visit, as I said, was to compel the king to abide by the agreement signed in that particular treaty. The clauses that were inserted in that particular treaty, he wanted to compel the king to comply. Now, before he will embark on a journey into Benin, first he must seek permission from his home country, that is the British government, because he was representing their interest in Benin. So he sought for their permission to visit Benin, but the British government did not grant him the permission. Now, the reason why they did not grant him permission to visit Benin was because there were no troops available that would accompany him into Benin. Should there be any uprising or any opposition in Benin, there will be no soldiers around to protect him. So that was why the British government did not grant him that particular permission. But without the permission, J.R. Phillips decided to send a letter to the Oba of Benin, informing him that he was coming into Benin to visit him. Now, when the letter was sent to the Oba replied J.R. Phillips that the timing of his visit was not conducive for him. Now, the reason was that the Oba was going to be engaged in a traditional festival that we call it the Agui Festival. And during that festival, the Oba was not supposed to welcome a foreigner. He was not supposed to entertain any visitor that was not from Benin or from Edo. So he replied J.R. Phillips that he should postpone his visit. In fact, there was a chief in Ishikiri who was also aware of the traditions of Benin, who advised J.R. Philip to postpone his visit to another day. But he insisted that he was going to visit Benin at the time he wanted. So on January 4th, 1897, J.R. Philip decided to visit Benin. So when he arrived at the gates of Benin, news got to the Oba that J.R. Philip and his entourage were already at the gate. So he quickly sent his soldiers to inform J.R. Philip to go back because the king was not ready to welcome him. Now the head of the soldiers was called Olobosere. I'm reading it here. So he led the soldiers and then they met J.R. Philip at the gate. Now they were trying to plead with J.R. Philip to postpone the visit because their Oba was so engaged such that he could not, he can't welcome any visitor. But in the process of trying to explain things to J.R. Philip, an argument ensued between them and it eventually resulted into a fight. And in that skirmishes, 7 out of the 9 Europeans that came with J.R. Philip, including J.R. Philip himself, were killed. And a few of them, out of the number that accompanied J.R. Philip, escaped but with wounds. Now, the incident was reported in England, and they became so furious over what happened. Now, they planned on how they were coming to revenge what happened in Benin, and they described the incident as Benin massacre. In other words, the Benin people had massacred Europeans, so there was need for a revenge. So they organized themselves, and in February 1897, the British government sent about 1,500 British soldiers into Benin. And as if the king, the Oba himself, knew that the British were coming for a revenge, so he called on the traditional chiefs to offer sacrifices to the gods in order to avert the revenge, the impending revenge of the British. But even with all the sacrifices, the human sacrifices that were rendered to the gods, the British still landed in Benin, as I said, in February 1897. Now, when they arrived, the first point of target was the palace, the Oba's court, where the king used to reside. So they visited that place, but the Oba had already run for his dear life. He fled and hid himself somewhere, but surrendered himself to the British after 6 months. So other chiefs, especially the Olobosere, who had led the fight against the Europeans, and others also ran into a hidden place where nobody could see them. Now when the British came, they set Benin Kingdom on fire, and for 7 days the kingdom burned, and they entered the palace and stole about 2,500 artworks from the palace of the Oba, including the original festal head. And all those artworks were taken to British museums and other European museums, where they display them in their museums today. Now, as I said earlier, after 6 months, the Oba surrendered himself to the Europeans, and they tried him and then found him not guilty. But even at that, they deported him to Calabar, and with 1 wife and 2 children, and he stayed in Calabar until his demise in 1914. Later, Olobosere and other chiefs that killed the 7 Europeans were also arrested. They were tried and found guilty. So all of them were hanged publicly. So that was what transpired in Benin in the 19th century.